Before we read the text in Esther chapter 6, I wanted to just throw out a few introductory things. We've seen some really cool elements to this story so far. We've talked about how Esther is a narrative. Esther is very much a story. It's a drama, and it's unfolded in some really cool ways. We've seen a cool plot already. We have seen some suspense. We've seen an unsuspecting heroine in Esther, coming as an orphan, becoming queen a few weeks back as we saw that. We've also seen this tension of basically the possibility of an entire people on the brink of annihilation, as we saw a couple of weeks ago as well. And so today, what we're going to see is a little bit of humor and irony. And when Bobby asked me to preach a while back, we picked a date, and I had no idea that this section in the scripture was going to be the passage that I was going to preach on until we started looking at it. And so when I started diving into Esther chapter 6, it just struck me how much irony is actually in this passage. And that's the title of the sermon today, God's Irony in the Ordinary. Haman inadvertently blesses Mordecai. And so, like I said, we've already seen some really cool pieces to the story, and today we see a little bit of even poetic justice, I guess you could say, for Haman. And so, again, before we read the text, I want to share a quick story with you. Have you ever really stuck your foot in your mouth when you're talking to somebody? You know that phrase? You say something, and then as soon as you say it, you realize you shouldn't have said it, or you realize that they were talking about something different. Well, when I was in 7th grade, we would go to the football games in junior high, and back then, I don't know how it was for you guys, but we didn't actually go to the games to watch the game. We went to socialize and hang out with our friends, And so a group of us were sitting around the concession stand, kind of just hanging out and talking. And at one point, all my friends had kind of walked off, and it was just me and this girl. Her name was Laura, and we were good friends, and that was it. We just had a couple of classes together, and I didn't see her as anything other than just a friend. And so we're talking, and eventually the conversation gets kind of serious, and she says, Daniel, I gotta ask you, you seem like a mature guy. She said, there's this boy that I really like. And she said, I really like him, and I'm not sure if he likes me, but I want to tell him that I like him, but I'm afraid if I tell him that I like him and then he doesn't like me, it's going to be really weird and awkward and everything. She's like, what should I do? Well, being this mature 7th grader that I was, I'm sure I had seen this on a movie or something, and I said, Laura, you just need to be honest with this guy. You need to tell him exactly how you feel. You need to take that risk because he might like you back. And she goes, okay. Well, you're the boy that I'm talking about, and I really like you. Do you want to be my boyfriend? And I went, oh, no, I don't even know what I said. I can't remember how I responded to her. But the point is, had I known that she was talking about me, I probably would not have given her that advice because I didn't like her like that. And so we've all had times in our life where we say something, and it's actually, the situation is different than what we think. And that's exactly what happens with Haman, and we're going to see that here in just a minute. So just to give a little bit more background, we are now 10 years into the reign of King Ahasuerus. I don't know if you realize that. I didn't until I started really looking at the notes on this, but the story itself, as we read through, it kind of goes pretty quickly, but if you look at the actual numbers, we're now 10 years into the king's reign, which also means we're 6 years now into Esther's reign. And again, it seems kind of funny because we're only 6 chapters in, and it seems like it's just day after day, but it's actually kind of spread out. And this story, this plot is taking a little bit of time, chronologically speaking, here in Esther chapter 6. And so it's a little bit slow moving, but we're getting to a really, really cool part today, and I'm excited to share that with you. So last week, you remember, we saw that Esther went to the king. She was well received by the king. And she basically told him, he said, what can I give you? You can have up to half my kingdom, anything you ask. And she said, well, how about you come to another banquet that I'm going to hold? And they said, okay. We also saw that after that, Haman goes home, and he throws a big Haman party, right? He throws this party for himself. Look at me, I'm awesome. And he brags about himself. He just really, really shows how prideful he is as a person and how arrogant he is. And not only that, but he ends up building these gallows on which to hang Mordecai. And so in today's story, we're really going to see those tables get turned, right? We're really going to see some of that come back to bite Haman here. So let's pick it up in chapter 6 of Esther. And just so you know, I'm actually reading out of the NASB. I know Baba usually does the ESV, and so if there's words on the screen, they may be a little different from what I'm reading. But Esther chapter 6, verse 1. During that night, the king could not sleep. So he gave an order to bring the book of records, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. It was found written what Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who were doorkeepers, that they had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. The king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." So the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace in order to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows which he had already prepared for him. The king's servants said to him, "Behold, Haman is standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor?" And Haman said to himself, "Whom would the king desire to honor more than me?" Then Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king desires to honor, let them bring a royal robe which the king has worn, and the horse on which the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown has been placed. And let the robe and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble princes, and let him array the man whom the king desires to honor, and lead him on horseback to the city square, and proclaim before him, 'Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor.'" And then verse 10, "Then the king said to Haman, 'Take quickly the robes and the horse as you have said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who is sitting at the king's gate. Do not fall short in anything of all that you have said.' So Haman took the robe and the horse and arrayed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city square and proclaimed before him, 'Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor.'" And we'll stop there for just a little bit as we talk about this. We see in verse 1 that the king couldn't sleep, right? We've probably all had some sleepless nights before. For me, that's a very rare thing. Usually, as soon as my head hits the pillow, I'm out like a baby. And I know some of you are like that. Maybe some of you have trouble sleeping. But we see here that the king really did have some trouble sleeping. And for me, the times that I do actually have trouble sleeping, usually it's either because I'm sick, which doesn't happen very often, or it's because God's trying to tell me something. And that may not be the case for everybody, but usually if that happens to me, I'll lay in bed awake praying, or I might even pull my Bible out of my phone and read some scripture. And usually that's a way that God tries to communicate with me if I can't sleep. A lot of times it's because there's something I haven't dealt with, there's an issue that I haven't resolved. And so we see that God kind of uses the lack of sleep for the king to really get his attention. And there was a quote from Spurgeon. He said, "Ahasuerus is master of 127 provinces, but not master of 10 minutes of sleep." It's kind of funny, this king, he had everything. We've already seen from the beginning of Esther, he had all these provinces, he had all these riches, he had all this wealth. Out of all these three characters, Esther, Haman, and the king probably should have been the one who was able to sleep, and yet he was the one who couldn't sleep. You think about this big day that both Esther and Haman are going to have the following day. Esther's going to go before the king again and basically plead for the lives of her people. Haman has this plan to go to the king and have him kill Mordecai. That was the one thing that Haman didn't have that he really wanted, was Mordecai dead. And so both of those two people really kind of had a reason to have sleepless nights, and maybe they did. The text doesn't say, but the point is the king is the one who couldn't sleep. It's very interesting. And as we look at this, we see that not only could he not sleep, but what did he choose to help him go to sleep? He chose to have the book of records read to him. Now, he could have counted sheep. He could have had an instrument come and played for him. He could have had music played to help him go to sleep. But instead, he asks for this book of records, or this book of Chronicles, to be read to him. And what is the one story that they read to him? It's the story of Mordecai saving the life of the king. Now, it had been 5 years since this happened. Again, you really don't see that in the text unless you look at the numbers, but it had been 5 years since Mordecai had saved the king's life, and yet he had never been rewarded for this. He had never gotten any kind of honor or glory out of the fact that he saved the king's life. And so the king has this read to him, and this is where the story really starts to get interesting. If you look back at Esther 2, really quickly, you don't have to turn there, but in 2, verse 23, after Mordecai saves the king, it says, "Now when the plot was investigated and found to be so, They were both hanged on the gallows, and it was written in the book of Chronicles in the king's presence. Now, when you read that a couple of weeks back, you probably don't think a whole lot about it. I know the Bible, throughout the Old Testament, a lot of times it'll say this was written down in the record of the king, that sort of thing. But that's really important as we see today. The fact that it was written down and that the writer actually mentioned that in chapter 2, it's very interesting and important for today's story. So here begins the irony. You have Haman, right? Imagine Haman probably woke up real early that morning, got his teeth brushed, maybe had a couple of cups of coffee. He was raring to go because he knew that he had quite a bit of influence with the king. We've already seen that in the story so far. And so he probably thought, this is going to be a home run. I'm going to knock it out of the park. All I got to do is walk in, talk to the king, tell him to hang Mordecai, and it's going to be done. And so he's waiting outside of the gate or waiting outside of the doorway of the king at this precise moment after the king has the story recounted to him of how Mordecai saved his life. And so Haman comes in because the king said, who's outside? They said, Haman. They said, bring him in. He comes in, and then, again, this is where it starts to get very, very interesting. And we start to see even deeper how proud Haman was, how much of a prideful person he was, how much of a big head he actually had, because the king says, what should I do to honor this person? And of course, Haman thinks immediately that the king is talking about him. And he says, well, you need to put the king's royal robes on him. You need to put him on the best horse and parade him through the city and do all this stuff. And because he thinks that's what the king is going to do for him. And so then as soon as he says that, the king says, okay, well, do that to Mordecai. Can you imagine if you were Haman? You know, if you're a fly on the wall, you probably could have heard Haman's heart drop from his chest down to the floor, right? Because his pride took such a huge blow in that moment. He was such a prideful person that as soon as the king not only told him, I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about Mordecai, who was at this point Haman's like mortal enemy, basically. You can only imagine the emotions and the things that went through Haman's mind. You know, if the book of Esther shows us anything, it shows us that God manages the affairs of men, right? And sometimes even without their knowledge. In fact, most of the time without their knowledge, especially as we see in this story. And God also knows what he's doing. We know that. And we know that even the courts of heaven, there are no coincidences. There are no surprises for God. And God had a plan. And we see that in chapter 6 today. Now, this can become a little bit difficult, kind of to chase a rabbit here a little bit, because we see how God manages things. And when things are good, we want to praise God, right? We want to say, yay, God, you're awesome. You made all these things work in a good way. But what about when bad things happen? You know, what if this hadn't happened in favor of Esther and in favor of Mordecai and in favor of the Jewish people? Sometimes in our life, that can really be a struggle because we want to see God in a way that kind of makes him look like he's always on our side. He's going to do everything for us, everything that is good for us. And sometimes bad things happen, right? I mean, sometimes, you know, people that we love die. Sometimes relationships are broken. Sometimes we lose our jobs. Sometimes things happen, and it doesn't seem like God's in control. And so when that happens, we really have to focus on the fact that God works all things together for good. That's what Romans 8:28 says. We know that verse well. All things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. And we understand that when Paul writes this, he says all things work together, the good and the bad, but they work together for God's purpose. So just a little side note there. Maybe you're in a place where you just keep hitting roadblocks, you know, and it seems like nothing is happening the way that it should happen, or maybe nothing is happening in your favor. Just remember that God is in control ultimately, and the bigger picture of it is that he has the world in his hands and he has things under control. Okay, so it is obvious that this situation is much more than that of chance. You know, some people who walk through this life, they kind of want to say, well, everything's up to chance. Everything is about luck, and everything is, you know, destiny or something like that. But we see in this story that that's not the case. The timing of this royal insomnia for the king, exquisite. The request of the reading of the records, much more than good luck. And the request not only of the reading of the records, but also the fact that he went to that very story of Mordecai saving the king. Again, much more than good luck. Invisibly, and without explicit comment in the text, and without the king or Haman knowing it, God is in control and God is at work. And I think that we see that throughout the entire story of Esther. I mean, that's what we've talked about for the last 5-6 weeks, is that God's providence is obvious throughout this story. So, we also see that Haman's response to the king, as we've already talked about a little bit, really shows his absolute vanity and pride, right? I mean, these honors that he thought he was going to have bestowed on himself ended up going to Mordecai. They were even greater than, say, Joseph in the story in Genesis 41, 42 through 43. This is what it says. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand and clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain about his neck, and he made him ride in his second chariot. So the honors that Haman once bestowed on himself is even greater than what we read years ago in the story of Joseph. He wanted the king's horse. He wanted the royal robes put on him. And so that just really kind of shows how prideful and how vain Haman actually is. You know, Haman would have been in a much better position had he heeded the words of Solomon. These two proverbs might be familiar to you. Proverbs 18:12. Before his downfall, a man's heart is proud, but humility comes before honor. Let me read that again. Before his downfall, a man's heart is proud, but humility comes before honor. That is not the case for Haman in this story, as we see. Another proverb, 25:27. It is not good to eat too much honey, nor is it honorable to seek one's own honor. And again, throughout this story in these last couple of weeks, we've really seen that was Haman. That was who he was. That was his identity, was to seek his own honor, to seek his own glory, from the awesome Haman party that he threw that we read about last week, to the fact that he thought the king was going to bestow these amazing honors on him. In today's story, we really see that he was all about his own glory, his own honor, and that's a big problem. But the question then kind of comes to us, right? How many times do we see ourselves a little bit like Haman? Sometimes we don't want to admit it. Sometimes we don't want to think about it that way, but and hopefully we're never as vain and as big-headed as Haman is in here. But I think definitely throughout life, we have times where we really desire glory and honor for ourselves, even if we don't think about it consciously. You know, whether it's wanting that raise at work or that promotion at work, you know, and then somebody else gets that promotion, and we think, well, I deserved it more than that person, and it just really takes a toll on our pride. And I'm not saying that promotions are bad and aspiring to have a promotion or having ambition is bad. I'm just saying that many times we get caught up in our own glory and our own pride and our own vanity, just as Haman did. There's an old hymn that I really love, and I think the words to this hymn kind of are the flip side of how Haman thought. And it says this: riches I heed not, nor man's empty praise, thou mine inheritance now and always, thou and thou only, the first in my heart, sovereign of heaven, my treasure thou art. High King of heaven, thou heaven's bright sun, grant be its joys after victory is won. Great heart of my own heart, whatever befall, still be thou my vision, O ruler of all. Has anybody heard that old hymn before? Be thou my vision. It's a beautiful, beautiful old hymn. You should go look it up and listen to it if you've never heard it. But those are the kinds of thoughts that we should have about our stance on this earth and who God is. Riches I heed not, nor man's empty praise. And so many times we chase after man's praise. We chase after honor and glory for ourselves. And really it's God who deserves the glory. It's God who deserves the who deserves the honor. And so as we read this story, we kind of want to say, oh, that bad Haman, you know, his head's this big. He thinks he deserves all these things. But when we really think about it, I think we need to understand that we too are like that at times. All right, so that first point we see is that Haman inadvertently blesses Mordecai, and he really does it in a way that, as we read, is prideful, and his pride takes a really, really huge blow. Point number 2 is that the writing at this point is really on the wall for Haman. Okay, verses 12 and 13 say this: Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried home, mourning with his head covered. Haman recounted to Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and Zeresh, his wife, said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him." The writing at this point, I think, is on the wall for Haman in two ways. Number one, Haman realizes that he's in big trouble, right? I mean, he's the one who made the king order this decree to annihilate the Jews. He's the one who hates Mordecai and has been very open and clear about that to all of his friends and all of his family. And now the king knows that Mordecai is the one who saved him. And not only that, as we see, I think next week or the week after, we find out that the king is going to know that Esther is a Jew. And so I think Haman really starts to understand that that the writing's on the wall and that he's in big trouble. You know, Haman, as the verse 13 kind of explains, or actually verse 12, he almost acts as if someone had died. You know, he's grieving. He covers his head. He acts as if something really terrible has happened. And I think that what has happened is that his pride has been dealt this death blow. You know, his head was this big. It got popped with a big pin or something like that. And now it's this big, and he realizes that that his pride has taken a huge hit. I mean, imagine having to take your vowed enemy through the king's streets, through the streets of the town on a horse, and honor him and let everybody know that he is the one who should be honored when you feel like you should be honored. Huge blow to the pride of Haman. And then another bout of irony I think that we see here is that now Haman is actually grieving in the way that the Jews grieved when they first found out about this decree. Think about that. You know, when the king, a couple of chapters back, makes this decree that on this certain day, the entire Jewish people should be annihilated and killed, I'm sure, as if anybody would, that all of them went into a huge, first of all, shock probably, and then a huge time of grieving and mourning. I mean, we see that Esther called on her people to do a fast and to do, I think it was a 3-day fast. And so we saw that they grieved because they realized, or they thought, that they had this doomsday coming, basically. And now Haman, it's kind of in reverse. He realizes that he is in big trouble, and now he's grieving in a similar way that he forced the Jews to grieve just a few chapters back. I think another thing that's very important here has to do with the wife of Haman and also his friends. And that is that even his friends and his wife realize that there is this higher power that is throwing these things into motion. At this point, especially his wife, she realizes that the God of the Jewish people is huge and is too big to overcome. I mean, she says it right there. If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. And we, of course, know that this force is the awesome and mighty hand of God. At that time, I don't know if Zeresh, his wife, really understood that, but the point is, it was pretty undeniable that whoever was behind what was happening was a powerful force, and we know that to be God himself. So let me ask you this. Has your pride ever taken like this huge blow? Have you ever really been brought down to the level of, feeling a couple of inches tall? Maybe it was, as I said earlier, work-related. Maybe it was family-related. Maybe you thought you were in line for this promotion or this raise, and then somebody else got it, and you just couldn't understand, why, God? Why would you allow them to have this when I deserve it, when it's mine for the taking? I think we've all probably had times like that. Or maybe it was a relationship. Maybe you were in a relationship with somebody and you thought everything was good, and you were feeling, this tall, and then there was a breakup or something happened. They hurt you in some way, they offended you in some way, and your pride took a huge blow. I'm sure we've all really had issues like that before. And we, just like Haman, struggle with those issues. We struggle with issues of vanity. We struggle with issues of pride, even if we don't like to admit it. So that's one thing I really want you to think about today, is asking yourself, number one, have I had those times? And number two, more importantly, have I really learned from those times when that's happened? Have I allowed God to use those times when my pride took a huge hit? Or am I just as prideful before as I ever was? We need to allow God to use those really, really hard times to change us and to make us into a new person, and to allow us to see that He is in control, and that even if we think we're in control and we think we're the top dog, God is the one who orchestrates things, and that can be brought down really quickly. The last thing I want us to really think about is this idea that that God was in such a way, He was in control in such a way that it was undeniable. And I want you to think about your life, or maybe the people around you. Have you ever seen God at work so strongly that it was undeniable that His hand was the one throwing it into motion? I think about kind of our journey, Jana and my journey throughout the years, and we were in New Orleans for 8 years. We studied at seminary there. I was on staff with Bobby at a church there, and we had several different chances or opportunities, I guess, to leave that church and to go to another place. And each time we said no because we didn't feel like it was right. And there was one time in particular, I shared this with our community group on Thursday night. There was one time in particular that a church called, and man, everything looked great on paper. Everything looked like it was a great opportunity. It was closer to my family, further away from hers, but closer to my family. It was a full-time gig, whereas before I was part-time. It was just all these things that looked so great on the surface. There was nothing wrong with the opportunity. There was nothing wrong with the position. There was nothing wrong with the church. In fact, the church was very missions-minded. It seemed like a great place to go. And yet, both Jana and myself felt like it was just not the right thing. And so we told them no, and it was hard, but we said, no, thank you. We prayed about it, and we don't think this is the right decision to make. And part of that was because I really had a desire to be in a place like Utah or somewhere around the country where there are much fewer churches than in the South where we grew up, which that's where this church was. We wanted to be in a place where the gospel really needed a presence. And so I knew that if we went to this position that wouldn't really fit that idea that I had, that I felt like God was calling us to do. So, really long story, fast forward, now we're here in Utah, and we're at a place where we felt like God was going to call us at some point, being in a church plant and being in a place where the gospel really needs to be proclaimed. Clearly, everywhere the gospel needs to be proclaimed, but as far as the number of churches, that sort of thing, this is where God wants us. This is where God wanted us 4 or 5 years ago, whenever that opportunity came. And so looking back, I see now that was part of the reason God told us, that's not for you. You need to stay where you are, was because He had this for us here, moving here a month ago. And so I'm sure that we've all had times in our life where we see that God is undeniably in control. Sometimes it may take a year before we even see it. Sometimes it takes 5 years before we even see it. I mean, like we said, for Esther, she'd been in reign 6 years now. 6 years she had been the queen, and it's just now coming to this head where she's going to have the opportunity, as we see next week, to save her people. And so I just want to ask you to really think about how God is in control around you. Sometimes we're so busy, man. We're so fast-paced. We got to do this. We got to go to soccer practice. We got to take the kids to dance or ballet, and we do all this, and we get so caught up in all of that we don't see God working around us. And that, to me, is a beautiful thing, to actually stop, be still, and think, God, how are you working around me? How are you intricately placing people in my life so that I can be a gospel witness, or so that I can have an influence on somebody at work or at the grocery store or wherever? And we get so busy that sometimes we don't allow God, or we don't allow ourselves to see what God is doing. So as we close this morning, I want us to just think about those couple of things. Number one, has your pride ever been dealt that huge blow like Haman had? And number two, from that? Have you learned about yourself and about how to become more humble and about how to not have that big head or not have that vanity or that pride? And then number 2, have you seen God working around you? Again, this is kind of the theme of the entire book of Esther, is that we see God's providence through persecution, especially with the Jewish people. And, it's not always through persecution. Sometimes we see God's providence just in the people that we meet and the places that we go. But the point is, as we see in this story, God is in control, God is at work, and He's going to work all things together for His good. Let's pray.